You're fired. It's only been a few days and Donald Trump is already on the firing trail. Brian Hook, his former Iran envoy, who was known to be tough on Iran, believing in maximum pressure, is out. Could that signal any clues? Could Trump 2.0 have a different approach to Iran? To find out more, we'll be speaking with Alexander Farley with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which is where Brian Hook used to work. I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Alexander Farley from the Woodrow Wilson Center joins us now here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being here, Alexander.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Alexander, Trump's inauguration speech really sidelined foreign policy. He didn't even really mention Iran, which was quite interesting given the times, given the position that Iran is in right now. And I was actually outside talking to a lot of Trump supporters on that day, and they were telling me that they were quite happy with that because they want this America First policy. They want isolationism. They don't want war with Iran. What did you make as an expert of Trump not really mentioning Iran in his speech?
Well, I think you said it. I think your analysis and what you reflected is quite accurate, that the campaign and the Trump administration is showing us it's going to take a rather isolationist, rather non-interventionist approach with its foreign policy. Now, I would say that every president faces a lot of foreign policy crises, so it's going to be difficult to say how President Trump is going to handle those. As opposed to his inauguration speech, we do see a lot of signs now of kind of how he'll treat some of these negotiations. He wants to engage with leaders directly. He wants to engage in negotiations on favorable terms in the way that he sees them. But it doesn't surprise me entirely that when, speaking to his voters, his constituents, and the vision he's laying out for the country, that he avoided foreign policy as a principal touchstone in some of the ways he's going to direct his administration.
So how do you see his vision then when it comes to Iran policy?
This is also an interesting question. We see some changes with some of the appointments he's making, some things that we didn't expect. I think the big contrast that I would highlight is going back to 2017 in his first administration, he brought in a lot of people that were very much in line with the Republican conference and kind of how they wanted to direct Iran policy, people who were very critical of the Obama-era policies and the JCPOA, and they had their reasons for that. So I think you got kind of that policy within the Trump administration. Perhaps what we're seeing now is an effort to define his own direction. You saw that Mr. Brian Hook got removed from the board of the Wilson Center. He was in many ways a principal character in the development of the maximum pressure policy. He deserves every benefit of the doubt in terms of his activity and his efforts as a distinguished foreign policy official and civil servant. And some other appointments I think also point to potential new ways of thinking. Michael Domino at the Pentagon, who's going to be in charge of Middle East policy, also seems to be sensitive and sympathetic to a more non-interventionist approach to foreign policy. So what I would expect is, rather than looking at some kind of foreign policy package, rather than looking at just how the party defines foreign policy issues along these lines, we'll really have to look closely at how Trump is going to approach these leaders and approach these major flashpoints in foreign policy directly. And that might get us a better sense of how he'll move forward with those.
Yeah, back in February, Domino actually criticized sort of that description of characterizing Iran in terms of fear-mongering, which is also very potentially indicative of how Trump may handle Iran this time around. And I'm glad you also mentioned Brian Hook, who worked at your center, obviously, at your think tank. He was somebody that a lot of Iranian Americans who don't necessarily agree with Trump in terms of domestic policy, they may be more liberal, more left-wing, even centered type of thinkers, but said, you know what? I'm voting for Trump because he's surrounding himself with people who understand Iran. And they would mention Brian Hook as an example. And a lot of Iranians are out on social media saying how disappointed they are with the firing. Now, we don't know why he was fired or the purpose behind it or if it had anything to do with Iran policy. But what does his firing of Brian Hook, and in such a public way, what does that indicate to you?
I'm not sure. I don't think I would make anything of the nature in which it was announced. I think we know at this point this is kind of Trump style to kind of call people out, to point it out in social media.
To John Bolton before,
Did that to
exactly.
John, but you mentioned John Bolton, right? John Bolton, much like Brian Hook, is someone who, here in DC we associate very closely with the maximum pressure school of policy toward Iran. And the fact that those two are removed must mean that the president is somewhat unsatisfied with how things went in his last administration. As we know, maximum pressure was a serious policy, and there were major decisions made within the government in terms of who to target, how to treat Iran, how to treat the allies of Iran. But there were reactions to that as well. Iran became more conservative. Iran became more embedded in the region in a lot of ways. That's changed recently, but perhaps that's what he's reflecting on. So if I was to interpret, and I should tread very carefully, that President Trump wants to engage with these issues on his own terms. He wants to determine the course. He doesn't want to preclude maybe making a deal if he thinks it's in his interests and in the U.S. interests. So I think, he's kind of maybe giving up on theory a little bit and maybe trying to take it in a new direction.
Did you work with Brian Hook at the center?
No, I didn't work with Brian Hook. Again, as I said, I think all I've heard that he was an active board member and he deserves every benefit of the doubt of, doing good work on behalf of the center. But as a staff within the Middle East program, I did not work with him, no.
Let's listen in on Senator, or now Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. He gave a speech recently on Iran, and it was quite bold. So let's have a listen in and then get your reaction after.
When we talk about Iran, I'm talking about the radical Shia clerics and not the people. The people of Iran are people of an ancient civilization, an ancient culture with tremendous pride and advances. And I don't know who take great pride in their Persian heritage and identity. And I don't know of any nation on earth in which there is a bigger difference between the people and those who govern them than what exists in Iran. And that's a fact that needs to be made repeatedly. In no way is the clerics who run that country representative of the people of that country and of its history and of contributions it's made to humanity. And it's a point I wish we would continue to make.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one thing I hear is Marco Rubio transforming into a very skilled diplomat. He knows how to complement the Iranian heritage. But I also hear, something that he's definitely familiar with working in the Senate and working in the Foreign Affairs Committee, of Iran's leaders being separate from its people. I wouldn't go so far as to say that he's indicating regime change as official policy, but I think as a senator, as someone who's been a foreign policy personality and a big one in the U.S. for a long time, he's making a case for a certain approach. And I think maybe what President Trump is doing is trying to make it clear that you have to convince me of which direction we should go. And then Marco Rubio is maybe articulating what I would consider more of like a classical hawkish approach to Iran. But I wouldn't say it's much different than what we know already.
So do you think Trump hasn't made up his mind yet on what he wants to do with Iran?
I think he wants to be flexible. I think he wants to be able to engage directly. And in terms of any kind of American deal with Iran, there's going to be a lot that we would ask. So it won't be easy, maybe even impossible. But I think that he's engaged with leaders that we would in the past have considered impossible to meet. He met with the leader of North Korea, and he's planning on making one of his first trips directly to China. So I think you have to read between the lines a little bit. He wants to criticize China on the campaign trail. There's a lot of skepticism towards China and the Chinese Communist Party, particularly in the Republican conference. But he's also saying he's willing to go meet with them directly to figure something out. We don't know exactly how that's going to go, but he's going to try to play a strong hand.
And how do you suppose they're reacting within the Iranian government itself?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think on the one hand, when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA in 2018, we got an immediate result from that. A couple years later, there were parliamentary elections, and we got a very conservative a draft of new representatives. We got a strengthened Supreme Council. We got a strengthened Khamenei. And then we had a lot of Iranian activity in the Middle East. So I don't think the Iranians are celebrating the election of Donald Trump, but there wasn't a lot of progress on direct U.S.-Iranian relations under Biden either. So I think they might be keeping an open mind and may perhaps interpreting some of these dismissals in the Trump orbit as a sign that maybe there's an opportunity to make an approach.
And how do you think Israel plays into all of this?
Israel plays a very important role. Obviously, Israel is going to be very strong in advocating a very stern approach to Iran. Obviously, Trump has a lot of incentive to support Israel and Israel's vision of foreign policy for the region. But again, I would caution anyone to say that that's a foreign policy that he's just going to pick up outright. I think he's going to see where he makes a deal. He's going to interpret everything in terms of its benefit rather than any kind of classical approach to foreign policy. So, but the biggest way that Israel plays a role in it is the serious damage it's done to Iran in the region. And we've seen, because of that damage and those big shifts, and then kind of unlocking the pressure from other groups to come make changes on the scene. So we saw the new election of the president of Lebanon, and already there's a pressure on Lebanon from Saudi Arabia, from other countries in the Middle East, from the U.S. on seriously changing its policy and controlling the activities of Hezbollah. So there's a new push for disarmament of Hezbollah that we haven't really seen since 1701 was originally signed, since the Taif Accords. So that's going to be a big update. We see Hayat Tahrir al-Sham take over in Syria. They're also now an avid and openly enemy of Iran and the groups that Iran supported and directly Bashar al-Assad's regime and other proxies that were very active in Syria. So I think Israel has already kind of tipped the balance away from Iran in some of its near environs, but is still going to advocate for a very strong and is going to advocate for keep pushing against its proxies in order to maintain its own security.
And Trump and Netanyahu have both said that they would not allow Iran to become a nuclear armed power. Do you think they're going to go as far as forming some sort of military coalition to make that happen? Like a joint military coalition?
We see this is also in the news. We saw Senator Graham advocating for this approach directly with Trump. Again, I don't think, based on the signs and how I read them, I don't think Trump is signing on to a particular foreign policy from the beginning. He kind of knows what he wants to achieve, maybe in vis-a-vis China, maybe a couple other areas. I think that he would put something on the table if the Iranians would make significant concessions to some of their activities in the region and for their nuclear program. I don't know what to make of some other things that might be important, such as the growing closeness between Iran and Russia, for example. And Russia was one of the main states and actually a very important state in the whole nuclear disarmament and the exporting of the enriched material. So I don't know how that's changing. And even, Trump's first term was very closely associated with Russia for various reasons the first time around. And yet he's shown to be somewhat critical of Putin this time around because, I think the board has changed. The board has changed significantly. We have Ukraine. We have a somewhat weakened Iran. So I don't think he would go in and make any promises to anyone that he's going to launch strike against maybe nuclear sites or something like that. But he's going to make it clear kind of where he stands, and he's going to demand that they come to the table and offer something that's in America's interests.
And Trump has also promised to end the war in Ukraine. So would that then end that kind of strategic relationship of convenience, if you will, between Iran and Russia? And how would that then impact the United States and Iran? Would that maybe force Iran's hand into making concessions?
I'm not entirely sure. I think that there will be a Russia-Iran connection so long as they are two states that are geopolitically opposed to the United States. I think that's the main force driving them together. There were certainly signs that they were making those kinds of connections even before Ukraine. And then Ukraine obviously created a whole new dimension of cooperation. For example, Iranians sending drones to support the Russian war effort in that country, even though Iran didn't necessarily have a dog in that fight or a stake in the outcome in Ukraine. It certainly wanted to appear favorable in Russian foreign policy. So that's a good question. Will ending the war in Ukraine completely change the calculus? It might give everyone a breather to kind of stop and reassess where they stand. But I think even if the Ukraine war ends, you'll see a strengthened ties between Iran and Russia, and you'll see strengthened ties between Iran and China, so long as the sanctions remain in place.
Now, if we go back to Israel and the ceasefire agreement, there's a lot of analysts who said, you know what, it was Trump who forced Netanyahu's hand into doing this. Do you think that that was a loss or a win for Iran, given how Hamas is a proxy of Iran?
I think on balance, it's a loss for Iran. You don't have the same leadership of Hamas that you did even a year ago. Yahya Sinwar is dead. Gaza is not Gaza's, excuse me. Hamas leadership is significantly weakened. They made a big show of coming out and showing force when the ceasefire was declared, but it's not the same organization. It doesn't have the same international backers it once did. It's not going to be as easy for the Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas axis to actually work interoperably anymore. So for that reason, I think Hamas is inevitably going to face changes. It doesn't look very good for Israel to have Hamas there, just because that was obviously what Netanyahu and his coalition expressly said they did not want. And the ceasefire agreement, I think, deserves a lot of credit from both the outgoing and the incoming administration, because as it said in the press, it is the same deal in effect as was announced back in May. So they've been working and iterating on that. And then Mr. Trump also declared that he wanted the deal, and that kind of pushed it the rest of the way through. But I think the trajectory was already there. If they were at the cusp of victory, it would be a much different scenario. But I think it is a loss for Iran, and it's certainly a complicated ceasefire, but it's not going to make Iran's resistance stance very much easier.
That's fascinating. And it sounds like Trump 2.0, when it comes to foreign policy in Iran, doesn't sound like he's that much different from President Biden.
Perhaps not. I think President Biden didn't come into office with a strong stance on Iran. He was kind of more like Obama 2.0, like he was more receptive to some kind of reconciliation. He was receptive to maybe re-entering the JCPOA. But as we kind of saw, and there was not much to go on in terms of renewing a commitment to that agreement. So things had to change. And then, if just being an analyst of the region, I think a lot of other things in the region changed. And so the Biden administration kind of went back to really challenging Iranian proxies and seeing them as, a main and a dangerous actor in the region. And we know that the outgoing Biden officials briefed the incoming Trump ones, and they focused a lot on Iran and its proxies and its activities in the region. So I think that in a way, maybe without signing on to a clear outcome and being determined to pursue a certain policy toward Iran, it seems like they're the same. But I do think they will take very different approaches. They'll take very different approaches in how they deal with Iran. They'll take different approaches with how they approach them diplomatically, or what kind of deals they want to put on the table, what the parameters of those deals were, what specific results they're demanding. I do think it will look much different.
And how so, in terms of maximum pressure, or how would you characterize that?
Well, I don't see why Mr. Trump won't go back to maximum pressure. Certainly he can try that. But he might try using more force where he can. Obviously strikes directly on Iran that's a pretty serious outcome, but there's still combat with the Houthis in Yemen, and there's still many active figures in Iraq, particularly with the Ashad al-Shabi, like the militias there, many of which are closely tied to Iran. There's still very active proxies still active in Syria and parts of the region. So if he wants to do this by choosing targets, he certainly can. That didn't stop them from the choosing Qasem Soleimani as a target back when they did. So that's one potential avenue that he'll choose. But I think they'll make a lot of demands in having Iran retreat from its activities that threaten Israel, retreat from its activities that threaten the Arab partners that Trump very much wants to build ties with, particularly Saudi Arabia. And I think and also the nuclear threshold, I don't think people in Mr. Trump's party are going to let go of that particular issue. I think that's very important to them and important for all of us. So I don't think he's going to drop that. But I think he's going to make, whereas Mr. Biden didn't necessarily approach Iran diplomatically and demand all these things, we haven't demanded Iran to dismantle its ballistic missile program since the JCPOA because it was something that they very much were reluctant to do. But something like that may be something that he brings up again, because this is considered something that threatens Israel. But he might put these things on the table and make a very stern demand and say, we might do something really serious if you don't come to the table and start talking to us about this. So that might be one approach he might take.
So it seems like the United States actually has a lot of options when it comes to dealing with Iran without having to go to the extreme of a direct war.
I think so, yes. Iran is very involved in all of its neighboring states. So if you consider it from that perspective, there are many different pressure points that you can put. I don't personally take it as just because they're down that strikes are the next inevitable outcome. Since they're down out of Syria, for example, one thing the United States could pursue vigorously in order to really challenge Iran is focusing on Lebanon and focusing on disarmament or reduction of influence of Hezbollah, because that has been a major threat toward Israel, continuing to be engaged in Gaza and making sure the Palestinian Authority has some governing role in Gaza in the future, and that Hamas eventually disarms. These are very important outcomes that could support a future policy. Also being engaged in Iraq, not leaving Iraq as a place where Iran could eventually recolonize and just use it as an outlet for its goods, being that it can't trade with many other partners. The United States has been very supportive of Iraq and supporting its banking system and making sure Iraq could be a bigger player in the global economy. And to some degree, Iraq is actually a competitor of Iran because it also exports oil. It's also right there on the Persian Gulf and exports through the Strait of Hormuz. So that's one reason why Iran doesn't want a strong Iraq. It wants it to be somewhat under its control. So there are many places where a Trump presidency could continue to put pressure on Iran and bring bear that pressure in the direction of some kind of deal.
Interesting. So you foresee a deal potentially in 2025?
I wouldn't say I foresee a deal, but I would say there will be some kind of effort to open up discussions with Iran. I think the first step would be to start placing that pressure, to start continuing the push and to gain on some of those areas where Iranian influence fell back. I think that would be the first step, because launching directly into a direct conflict could have the opposite effect. All those forces and all those gains could just end up coming right back. And so that creates much more unpredictability. But leaning into the kind of the weakening some of the cracks that we've seen and trying to widen those would probably be a more effective policy. So going in that way would have a certain result. But I think just given some of what we know, certainly not everything, but some of what we know how Mr. Trump has engaged on these things in the past, he might dangle some kind of opportunity to negotiate along with a very aggressive policy on those fronts.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I guess time will tell what happens and also what path Iran will take. Will it go towards, diplomacy and negotiations, which they seem to be indicating that they want to be doing, given how weak they are right now? Or are they going to go more and become isolated in the process, potentially?
Yeah, I think they're isolated now. The Europeans aren't too happy with them. They've really reneged and shown lack of interest in making progress on the nuclear goals. The Europeans are kind of the ones who have been left with that whole portfolio. So you have that community, you have the United States, still has very heavy sanctions on Iran. Not many of them have been removed. It's still strengthening its relationship with China and Russia, but this hasn't really translated to a big economic windfall. It's trying to repair its relations with its Arab neighbors, but its Arab neighbors are going to approach that very cautiously. They're not going to pivot on a dime. They want to have good relations with their big neighbor, obviously, but they're not necessarily in a place where they're going to completely open up to the Iranians either, because of also the disruption of their proxies in Yemen and Iraq and in Lebanon. So it's a complicated region. So I would say, yes, the Iranians are isolated. That's a fact. So being that they've been pushed back, I think the next logical outcome, and of course I don't really know exactly what they'll do, but the next logical outcome would be to come back to the table and give themselves some breathing room so they can reconsolidate, some of the control where they have it. But coming back and bouncing back with an aggressive stance might not work for them.
Exactly. And, last year, a lot of analysts inside Iran were saying that they were almost predicting an engineering of a Pezeshkian win, because they believe, those Iran analysts inside Iran, that Donald Trump was going to become the next president of the United States, and they felt that they needed somebody like Pezeshkian in power while Trump was in power.
Well, perhaps. I think that the analysts may have had a point that a Pezeshkian presidency would create an opening for negotiation where a Raisi president would not. I don't know about the engineering the win. Obviously, Iran isn't a true democracy in the sense that it speaks exactly with the voice of the people. But I think they may have been right on that front. And then, back then we were saying that people were speculating. Obviously, a lot of people were forced out of the race, but obviously Khamenei had to clear the way for Mr. Pezeshkian to win. So maybe there was some consensus at the higher levels that doing something collaborative or doing something diplomatic in whatever form may have been a favorable outcome.
Is there anything else you'd like to add on Trump 2.0 and Iran?
I think it's going to be interesting to watch. I think I would watch for any kind of direct communication. I think Mr. Trump likes to publicize these things when he can, so there may be some things to comment on. And I would really be looking at those theaters around the region, like Hezbollah is down, but not out. Hamas is down, but not out. So there's going to take a lot of efforts. And the Houthis in Yemen are also somewhat down, but have been relatively untouched by the conflicts going on in the Mediterranean part of the region. So I think looking at those regions and seeing how this new Rubio State Department and Trump presidency want to address those as part of potentially interpreting more grand policy toward Iran.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much, Alexander Farley with the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.